We are delighted that you could join us for this important program. As we know, anti-Semitism and even violent anti-Semitism has been surging worldwide. We also know from history that being silent and hoping it goes away is not effective. So, what can a lone individual do? It seems like an overwhelming task. We have seen some recent examples, though. Let's take a moment to look again at this video clip of anti-Semitic attack in Bondi Beach, Australia, and what one individual can do, did do.
As gunfire erupted at Sydney's Bondi Beach on December 14th, hundreds of people ran for cover, but one man moved in the opposite direction, straight toward the gunman. Video seen around the world shows Ahmed al-Ahmed charging the shooter, tackling him to the ground and wrestling away his weapon.
I don't want to hear his gun. I don't want to, see people, screaming and begging, asking help, help. And that's my soul asked me to do that. And all and everything in my heart and my brain, everything, it's worked, just to manage and to save the people's life.
In a CBS News exclusive interview, the fruit shop owner and father of two is speaking publicly for the first time since the terror attack. It happened during a Hanukkah celebration. 15 people were killed. Al-Ahmed was shot 5 times as he intervened.
I know I save lots of people's life, innocent kids and women and all this and men. And I know I save lots, but I feel sorry still for the lost.
There are also, of course, organizations standing up and working to combat current anti-Semitism. Generations After is focusing on this issue in all of our programs this year. We are delighted to have as our guest speaker today Dr. Brian Hughes, the director of the Shoah Foundation's Countering Anti-Semitism Laboratory, or CAL, CAL. CAL works to prevent and reduce anti-Semitic attitudes through the use of evidence-backed interventions. Dr. Hughes is a media and communications scholar. His research explores the impact of media technology on political and religious extremism, targeted violence, conspiracy, and fringe culture. Just a note that after the presentation, there's going to be a Q&A, so please enter your questions into the chat as they occur to you, and we will do our best to address them after the presentation. And now I am delighted to turn the program over to guest Dr. Brian Hughes. Dr. Hughes.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And thank you everyone for coming today. I'm really, really delighted to be speaking with you all. I'll just get started. I have a lot to cover, but I guess I'll just begin by saying that the violence we saw at Bondi Beach, it's never easy to look at. It's never easy to hear about. And at the same time, it's the absolute worst case scenario of a negative process that's actually very long. The atmosphere of anti-Semitism that we're experiencing today and that has been experienced historically for thousands of years has a lot of negative consequences even before it reaches that point of violence. And so with CAL, let me advance the slides here. With CAL, what we really try to do is develop, as Rachel said, scientific solutions, tested, proven effective, proven safe solutions that are going to help to reduce the conditions that give rise to anti-Semitism in our society and globally, so that hopefully they're much less likely to reach that point that we saw at Bondi and that we are seeing more and more frequently, sadly, which is the worst possible outcome. Now, with that said, I always feel like I have a little bit of privilege when I give these talks because, in a way, I'm the guy who gets to give the good news. Things are very dire at the moment. There has been some very troubling backsliding, and things are worse than they've been in my lifetime. But we do have solutions that we know work. The question isn't how can we find ways to reduce anti-Semitism in society? The question is how can we scale them and how can we find more? Because we have ways that we know work. And that's what Cal tries to do. I'm going to detail one very specific and I think very effective way that we do that, that actually you all can take into your lives after this is over. But quickly, I'll just introduce the lab. I'm not going to go into all these details, but there are really four areas where the lab does most of its work. The first is in collecting testimony. Everything that we do at the Shoah Foundation is based in survivor testimony, working with survivors so that they can tell their own stories and so that we can then use those stories as educational tools to try to teach about the Holocaust, violence and prejudice against Jews up until the present day, to counter anti-Semitism where it already exists, and hopefully to prevent it. So we're doing a lot of work right now to expand that contemporary side of the collection. We have something like 60,000 testimonies, and the vast, vast, vast majority of those are Holocaust testimonies. But anti-Semitism didn't stop in 1945, and there are a lot of Jewish communities that weren't necessarily captured in those very early archives that we developed. So we're trying to expand it to rectify that. We also do training. We try to identify different sectors of society where people have a sort of unique opportunity to intervene and to bring some of these proven effective practices out into the world. So that's people like attorneys, journalists, certainly students, local city governments. Really, the list goes on because every sector in society has its own way that it can contribute. So we develop trainings and we tailor them to try to accomplish that. Um, Obviously, the internet is a huge problem. If you ask me, there are really two things driving our current moment of crisis. One of them is the loss of the survivor generation. We have precious few survivors left, and there really is no substitute for in-person encounters and testimony. But the second is the internet. The internet has revived patterns of anti-Semitism that we thought were, put to bed in the 1600s. They're coming back. And it's also a way to spread it far and wide and to reach people who are vulnerable. And I'll get to those vulnerabilities in a second. And then finally, we have what we just call pure research. We want to rescue the best science from out of the ivory tower, and we want to bring it into the real world. We want to see what good it can actually do when we put it out there in society. And then we want to test it. We want to make sure it has a good impact. And so we're continuing to pilot new programs all the time. But the core question that we need to be addressing in all of these interventions is why are people anti-Semitic? Why do they become anti-Semitic or adopt attitudes and behaviors that support anti-Semitism? Why do they do that? Because if we understand why they do that, then we can begin to prevent it. And in some ways, actually, in the kind of personal ways, the personal reasons why people adopt anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism can be very, very similar to other hatreds. People have social vulnerabilities and they have emotional vulnerabilities that make anti-Semitism seem like a good solution to their problems and a reasonable way to view the world. Now, I don't want to let people off the hook. There's a question of moral shortcoming here too. But if we're trying to look at this scientifically, we have to focus on those things that we can change, and morality is not really one of those. Um, But anti-Semitism, it offers simple answers to complex problems. It, Jews are a convenient scapegoat. And that gives you a sense of control in a very scary world. Things are changing extremely rapidly now. People feel very much not in control of their lives. And having a scapegoat to blame for that makes people feel a little bit less afraid. One of the things that makes people feel the most afraid is a fear of losing social status, or economic status. Economically, times are tough. The boom of the second half of the 20th century is over. We're contracting a little bit. People are seeing the quality of their children's life decline a little bit. They're seeing the quality of their own lives decline a little bit. Um, and at the same time, we're also seeing greater cultural, racial, gender integration across our societies. So people who might have occupied a superior position in society just by virtue of, the color skin that they were born into, um, don't aren't able to count on that in the same way. And so that fear of losing status also leads people to look around for a scapegoat. And then finally, this is really where the internet comes in. There's a question of social pressure and this idea, the fact that people believe what they think everyone else believes. So if a person who doesn't necessarily understand the world around them is anxious, is seeing their status slip away, and they're online and they're served a lot of content that has anti-Semitic tropes in it, they're going to believe that anti-Semitism is even more prevalent than it actually is. And that gives people permission. And it also gives people a sense that, well, if everyone else believes it, well, there's probably something to it. But the fact is, not everyone else believes it. It's this illusion that's produced by the algorithm and our social media echo chambers. Now, the fact is, though, like I said, these vulnerabilities, these are more or less the vulnerabilities that lead people to adopt anti-Black racism or extreme misogyny or you name it. Um, the thing that changes that question of which bias, which hatred they adopt, is which bias, which hatred is readily available. What is the prejudice? What is the scapegoat that can come in to fill these vulnerabilities and make them feel better? And this is where anti-Semitism is unique. This is where there really is no other bias or hate like anti-Semitism. There are social conditions that make anti-Semitism the most readily available form of prejudice and bias. It's perennial, depending on how you want to measure it. Goes back 3,500 years. You can stretch it back further than that if you really want to go into the mists of time. Um, and it's been present in every major historical period in the West and the Near East, and even to a lesser extent in the Far East. And what this means, particularly for Americans and Europeans and people who kind of come out of that history, is that all of our institutions, all of our modes of thought, are tainted with anti-Semitism. There's a wonderful book. I mean, it's a disturbing book, but it's incredibly well written, well researched, called Anti-Semitism: The Western Tradition by David Nirenberg. And he maps at every point in the cultural, political, and economic development from ancient Egypt to today how every single new paradigm was introduced with prejudice against Jews. And very frequently, with people arguing at each other that even though neither one of us is racially or religiously Jewish, you're the real Jew. No, 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 you're the real Jew. So when you have a cultural and social history like this, it makes anti-Semitism the common denominator hatred that you see throughout history and up to the present day. And that's why it is more likely to be the form of hate and scapegoating that fills those social and emotional vulnerabilities that people feel. So, with Cal, in a way, that kind of cuts out our work for us. We see what we have to do, which is We have to identify those social and emotional vulnerabilities, and we have to find that in a very specific way because it's different for people in different socioeconomic groups. It's different for people in different racial groups or age groups or national groups. We have to find what shape those vulnerabilities take in each of those different corners of the world. And then we need to find a way to address those vulnerabilities so that anti-Semitism doesn't rush in and fill the gap. So here's where the good news is. That was a lot of bad news, but it wasn't news to anyone, but there's a lot of a lot of negativity. Here's where the positivity comes in. We have solutions that work. We test, and we're not the only ones. This has been going on for a while. We know that there are ways where we can address those social and emotional vulnerabilities. And in some ways, we can even begin to claw back some of those societal patterns that make anti-Semitism so readily available. And one of the reasons why we can do this is actually because anti-Semitism is not based in fact. People don't become anti-Semites through careful weighing of what's true and what's false. They become anti-Semites for kind of dark, emotional, and even instinctive reasons. And those are actually easier to address in many cases than the kind of political discourse where you're arguing about facts and the perception of facts can really make it impossible to speak in the language that one another understands. We don't have to deal with that. Um, Sometimes it makes it harder because smart people fall for this, well-meaning people fall for this. Historically, anti-Semitism has very often been presented as sort of a project of moral betterment. And so we have to be able to meet people where they are. We can't assume that they're ignorant. We can't assume that they have evil intentions. We have to assume that they have flaws, significant flaws in some cases, moral flaws in some cases, but flaws that can be addressed. So we can protect our communities. We can make this hatred less likely to grow, less likely to metastasize, and less likely to express itself in these outbursts of violence like we saw at Bondi Beach. And I'm going to show you now one way that I've been very active in developing over the course of my career. The fancy name, the name in all the scientific journals is called attitudinal inoculation, but we like to call it pre-bunking. So you've heard of debunking. Debunking is when someone believes a false fact, and you say, well, actually, that's not true. Here's what the real fact is, and this is what the New York Times says, or this is what the New England Journal of Medicine says. So now you have the real facts. Now you know what's true. Debunking works, um, but it tends to work best on the people who need it the least. It works on the people who make their judgments based on facts. And that doesn't tend to be the problem with anti-Semitism. Or, I mean, rather, those aren't the kinds of people who become seriously anti-Semitic. But what pre-bunking does is it gives individuals the ability to recognize when their social and emotional vulnerabilities are being attacked by anti-Semitic propaganda. Anti-Semitic propaganda is everywhere. What this means is that it kind of works best on the people who are uncommitted. The people who already are anti-Semites, God bless. We need to be giving them resources. We need to be elevating their voices. We don't need to convince them of anything. The people who are hardcore anti-Semites, they need to be reached in different ways. And in fact, de-radicalization is still a nut that science has yet to crack. It's a very individual, very idiosyncratic process. We don't know how to do it consistently, much less at scale. But here's where there's a little hope in the mix. The uncommitted are the vast majority. The vast majority of people don't have very strong opinions. The vast majority of people are persuadable. The vast majority of people, they might adopt an anti-Semitic attitude here and there, but they don't make it a core part of their identity and their commitment for how they're going to live, which means we can reach them and we can fix those social and emotional vulnerabilities. Maybe not permanently, maybe not 100%, but enough that at a population-wide level, if we're reaching enough individuals and we're improving those emotional and instinctive factors enough, we can see actual measurable reductions in anti-Semitic attitudes and behaviors. And that's really what it's all about. So I'm going to show you. This is a tool that we use. I'm going to show it to you, and then I'm going to explain how it works, and then I'm going to show it to you again. It's about a 90-second video.
Since the start of the war in Gaza, you may have seen images like this, calling the attacks of October 7th an act of decolonization or liberation. But images like these are manipulated. It uses a classic propaganda technique called transfer, which uses positive or negative symbols from one thing and tries to transfer those feelings to another. In this case, it's using stirring and recognizable imagery that recalls movements of the past. By doing this, it's trying to transfer our feelings about those movements to the actions of Hamas. But the idea of liberation under Hamas is misleading. Hamas is an authoritarian group which denies basic human rights, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, freedom of speech for journalists, and many more. Fighting for the dignity of all peoples, both Israeli and Palestinian, does not mean condoning the actions of Hamas, a violent, oppressive organization. So if you see a message that looks and sounds like this, associating the attacks of October 7th with liberation, it's very possible someone is trying to manipulate you for their own agenda. It's important to make up your own mind. Think twice before believing it or sharing it. Since
Excuse me a moment. Let me advance the slides manually here. Now, parallel research was my previous lab at American University. What you just saw was a pre-bunking video. And, to a person who doesn't know the formula that I'm going to explain here, it might look like any other paid political message or public service announcement or something like that. And you may say, well, okay, that's all very well and good, but what makes that any better than any other political message or public service announcement that people see? The difference is this formula. And this is a formula for persuading people and giving them kind of mental antibodies to resist propaganda that has been developed and honed and tested since the mid 1960s. The practice of attitudinal inoculation is over 50 years old at this point. It's older than many medical interventions that we might be using nowadays. And it works like this. So first we have what's called a three-step alert. And you heard this, they said, since the start of the war in Gaza, you may have heard messages like this. So we want to tell the audience, out there in the real world, yes, you're going to encounter false and harmful information. And people get tricked by that. This is the thing where being smart and being moral is no defense, because this information is manipulatively presented. The only way to be able to keep yourself safe is to recognize it, understand how it works, and protect your freedom to make up your own mind and to live by your own values. And this is what we call priming. Because what this does is it sets the stakes for people. People really value their freedom of conscience. People hate being manipulated, and especially in places like the United States that are pretty individualistic, people hate it even more than in more kind of collective style cultures. So once we do this, people sit up. They take notice. We're able to measure that there actually are cognitive and emotional changes that happen in people when they're given this three-step alert. So with their antenna up and listening and understanding that there's a threat to something that they really value, then we can give them what we call the microdose and the refutation. So this is where we showed that's an actual example of propaganda. I'm very sad to say it was a pamphlet that appeared in the little library. I'm pointing to my neighbor right now. It's about 15 feet in front of me out the window and 5 feet to the left. I took it out and I said, this is a microdose that we can use. And it's kind of like in a actual vaccine, like a smallpox vaccine, like the old smallpox vaccines, where you had an actual bit of dead virus. And so if you have this very brief example of real propaganda and you couch it in an explanation of how it's manipulative and why it's harmful, then the propaganda does no harm. And in fact, people begin to have more of those cognitive and emotional reactions. Only now, instead of just sort of a general sense of alert, it's things like a sense of irritation or disgust or anger at that propaganda and the broader message that it embodies. And this is very interesting because disgust is a very important emotion, evolutionarily speaking. Disgust is the emotion or the feeling. I don't even know if you could call it an emotion. It's the instinctive feeling that keeps us away from things like rotten food. It keeps us away from dead bodies and things like that. It keeps us clean and free of disease. So it's very interesting that it's the feeling of disgust more than anything else that's being elicited once we engage in this process. And we've shown that adding some counter narratives like you saw there, actually Hamas is bad on women's rights, bad on free speech, bad on gay rights, violent, all that. That actually gives us a little extra boost. We see better results if we give a little bit of a counter argument, but you don't want to give too much because again, really what we're doing is we're trying to show people that they need to be free to make up their own minds according to their own values and that this propaganda is a threat. So if we're, up there giving a lecture, it kind of counteracts that. And we really don't need to. People begin to develop their own counter arguments without our help. And then finally, we have a call to action. So this just leaves the audience with a feeling of efficacy, a feeling of capability, a feeling like, oh, okay, now I know what it takes to protect myself, to protect my freedom of conscience. We don't want people to go out there feeling afraid. We want them to go out there feeling confident. But as I said, we want them to go out there uh, knowing that ultimately it's their own judgment and their own discernment that's going to be identifying and resisting propaganda like this when they actually encounter it. Because if we're telling them, if we're giving them a lecture, if we're giving them a set of rules, you could talk about whether ethically that's good or bad. And, there's arguments on both sides, I think. But from just a practical point of view, it's more effective when people develop their own mental antibodies. Right? So I'm going to show the video one more time so you can watch it with those 3 steps of the formula in mind. Remember, it's 3-step warning, microdose and refutation, reassurance and call to action. Okay, so I'm going to play it again now.
Since the start of the war in Gaza, you may have seen images like this, calling the attacks of October 7th an act of decolonization or liberation. But images like these are manipulative. It uses a classic propaganda technique called transfer, which uses positive or negative symbols from one thing and tries to transfer those feelings to another. In this case, it's using stirring and recognizable imagery that recalls movements of the past. By doing this, it's trying to transfer our feelings about those movements to the actions of Hamas. But the idea of liberation under Hamas is misleading. Hamas is an authoritarian group which denies basic human rights, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, freedom of speech for journalists, and many more. Fighting for the dignity of all peoples, both Israeli and Palestinian, does not mean condoning the actions of Hamas. a violent, oppressive organization. So if you see a message that looks and sounds like this, associating the attacks of October 7th with liberation, it's very possible someone is trying to manipulate you for their own agenda. It's important to make up your own mind. Think twice before believing it or sharing it.
So now you kind of have an idea of how that works. And as I said at the beginning of my remarks, we need to be meeting our audience where they are. We need to be finding very specific social and emotional vulnerabilities that are, if not unique, at least very common to a certain audience. What works on high school kids is not necessarily going to work on 40-year-old attorneys. And as you might have guessed already, that was a video that was directed at college-aged Americans. And college-aged Americans have a very strong desire to be seen as working for justice, working for equality, being on the right side of history, rooting for the underdog. And so we tailored this video in a way that addressed those social and emotional traits that can either be exploited as vulnerabilities or that can be turned around as motivations to change from bystanders to upstanders. And the results were really dramatic. So we always test things before we roll them out into the real world. We have to make sure that there's no backfire effect. We have to make sure that money is being spent responsibly, and so on. So we tested 5,000 college-aged Americans. We were able to get an opt-in sample, which is sort of the second best. You know, it's not like a random sample of everyone in the population, but it's random enough that you can rely on the results if you have a large enough number. 5,000 is a very large number for a study like this. In fact, this was the largest study of inoculation against anti-Semitism that had ever been done. To this date, it's the largest one that has ever been done. And what we saw is that that video, that little 90-second video, can make a profound difference. When you compare uh, a group that large of college-aged Americans who watched that video versus college-aged Americans who didn't watch that video, and then you gave them each a big, long survey, long list of questions measuring their attitudes about Jews and Israel and Hamas and politics, and it was long. It was a 20-minute survey. What we found is that people who watched the video, on average, were 17.7% more likely to understand that this idea of Hamas as a force for liberation or decolonization was false, harmful, and manipulative. They were 7.3% more likely to disagree intellectually, but then they were 12.4% angrier with this rhetoric of decolonization, 19.4% more disgusted, there's that really powerful feeling, and 13.6% on average more irritated by this claim that Hamas is a force for good. Those are statistically significant. That means that we know, based on the size of the sample and the quality of the sample, that this should translate out into the real world. It's not a fluke of statistics. We talked to too many college-aged Americans for it to be a fluke. But this is where it really plugs into the theme of this talk, which is that people who watched this video on average were 23.9% more likely to say that they would challenge this decolonization rhetoric if they encountered it online in real life. That's an improvement of nearly a quarter of the population of people who saw this video saying, not only do I now understand this is bad, I'm not going to be a bystander. I intend to be an upstander. That's really significant. So when we had those results, We took our ad spend budget and we purchased ads on social media to distribute it to college-aged Americans. That's one of the good things about online is that you can target ads that precisely. And I see that I am just about out of time. So I'm going to skip my slide about how we plan to keep going with this. We do plan to keep going with it. I'll say that the one big change is that we want to see how we can incorporate survivor testimony. We want to see how that can improve things. But here's where it can be rolled out into your communities. Anyone can do this. You don't need an ad budget. You don't necessarily need to be testing this yourself because you're going to be operating on a smaller scale and it's going to be more personal. But what you can do when you're out there, when you're online, or when you're watching the news, if you see a piece of propaganda, do what you can to save it. Take a screenshot, take a photo with your phone, and then once you have that, if you want to do this, go to Wikipedia. This is one area where Wikipedia is reliable and good. I wouldn't listen to them when they're talking about the Israel-Hamas war. There's a lot of problems there. But if you go to the types of propaganda page on Wikipedia, they have an excellent glossary and explanation of all the different types of propaganda. So you can take your piece of propaganda or mis or disinformation that you've seen, you can compare it to the list and you can say, oh, this is transfer, or oh, this is scapegoating. And then what you can do is you can incorporate this into your conversations out there in your community, at work, wherever, where you're concerned that people might be at risk for falling for this kind of propaganda. You can just say, I was watching the news the other day and I heard someone saying this thing. And I know that this kind of rhetoric can actually manipulate people's feelings and instincts. But actually, if you look at what this person said, this is actually a form of transfer, and that's a form of propaganda. If you deliver this in person, it's a way, on average, as individuals, we can begin to improve the overall climate of our communities. And of course, this is a method for education. It's something we can begin getting in schools. Museums are beginning to adopt it. So it's really beginning to have legs. And, having been working on this specifically for many years, it's very heartening to see that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hughes, for that really interesting and outstanding presentation. I think I'm going to try to take it home with me and make use of it at anything that we do. We're now going to turn, well, on behalf of us all, I'd like to thank Dr. Hughes, as well as the program committee, the generations after, and our tech guru, Ephraim Katsir. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. Everyone who registered for the program will receive a link to the recording on our YouTube channel within a few days. The recording will have closed captioning. We would appreciate your completing a very brief survey about today's program to aid us in developing future programs. The link is in the chat now. If you are a current member, thank you. If you'd like to become a new member or renew your membership, please join. Remember that only paid-up members can participate in the Speakers Bureau, our wonderful Speakers Bureau, the book group, and our writing groups. Your dues also contribute to Remember a Child, programs such as today's, and to continued survivor welfare. We are also happy to receive a one-time donation for this free program. Please visit our website at genafterdc.org to learn more. Thank you all for participating today. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and we'll see you at our next program.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.